Hey kids, so the Zoom session that I thought I was recording did not record because I thought I would record to my iCloud, but it would not, and I didn't have enough space on my laptop. So I'm rectifying that situation right now by doing this little video for you to try to recreate the session that we had. However, unfortunately, you're just going to have to listen to me talk. You won't be able to hear your peers, come up with the answers that I ask questions to. All right, so here we are looking at the world. You can see what a small part of the world Britain is, and really what a relatively small part of the world the Germanic tribes came from. So this is Scandinavia, up here, all of Norway, Denmark, and then Germany, a little bit of France here, especially later, near the 10th century and 9th century. Okay, so at the beginning of essentially at year zero, if we're going to go by Jesus' time, the Romans had an empire that took up a lot of this area here, Greece, and parts of the top of North Africa as well. So this was all under the Roman Empire. And for centuries, these German tribes up here were trying to do raids on the Roman Empire, mostly because this Mediterranean area down here and even into Turkey, it's a warmer climate. It's a lot easier to grow things. It's better living, it's easier living. And I think these Germanic tribes were tired of seeing how the Romans rule the world as they knew it. So after centuries of trying to do raids, they finally became a little bit successful. And the Goths had a fairly successful pact with the empire, and then did some raids that kind of ruined them here. They withdrew their armies from Britain to help retain the empire here, and once that freed up Britain, also the Celts and the Scots, they were all trying to beat back the Roman Empire. It sort of left it up, and three of the Germanic tribes that came down here moved west this way, and they are the ones that settled this little corner of the island here. So those were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. And this is essentially how they started ruling this area here. The last video, I talked about this more in depth, so you can watch that if you need a refresher. So we're going to go to the next set of slides that talks more about Beowulf and the language of Beowulf. So I mentioned in the last video that really Beowulf is about language, and I'm going to explain that a little bit more. But first, we're going to answer the question of what did Old English look like? So really, it's asking the question of what did this Germanic writing look like? You've seen some of Old English, right? I've typed it out for you. Here, hello, here it is. You can kind of see how it's spelled out. But the question is, what did it look like when they looked at it back then? So here's an answer. They used an alphabet called runes. So each letter is called a rune, and this is called the runic alphabet. I don't know this alphabet. I don't know what any of these letters mean, except for three of them, because three of them were left over and were used in Old English. One of them we can see right here. It's called the thorn. And you guys will probably recognize this letter or this rune. So the Anglo-Saxon culture was mostly an oral culture. That means they didn't actually write a lot of stuff down. And what they did write down was etched into wood or onto stone. So that's why all the lines are so straight. All runic lettering had a top line and a bottom line, and then they're mostly just straight lines except for this rune right here, which is sort of squiggly, and then a couple dots. But mostly they made it as easy as possible for themselves to okay, still recording. and now I'm paranoid, as easy as possible for themselves to write out what they wanted to write out, which wasn't a lot. They came up with stories, they memorized those stories, they were very clever with language. They could speak in verse, and they could use all sorts of assonance and consonant and alliteration and rhyme just off the tip of their tongue. Okay, so this is the very beginning of Old English. Little parts of Beowulf were written down on stone or wood in the runic alphabet before it was written down as its whole epic poem. So you know Beowulf wasn't written down in its entirety until much later, until the 9th century. So how did it go from the runic alphabet to the Latin alphabet? That's a good question. So the Germanic tribes settled Britain. They stopped raiding and they started colonizing. As time passed, they became more and more Christianized. And the people who started transcribing stories from their oral culture were the monks, and these are Christian monks. And those monks used the Latin alphabet. So they started writing down the oral traditions of the Anglos and the Saxons and the Jutes using the Latin alphabet. And by the 10th century, Beowulf was finally written down in full using almost entirely a Latinized alphabet. But they used 3 runic letters. I'm not sure why only 3 or 3 at all. But you'll recognize this one, the thorn, as one of them. Nice letters you got there. Mind if I borrow some? Sure, just don't take them all at once. So I'm not exactly sure why that happened, except that they must have thought those letters useful. Okay, so here is the very beginning of, let's make it big. Here's the very beginning of Beowulf. We've looked at this many times before in class, and this is the first line. There are 4 lines here, so 1, 2, 3, 4. This letter here, you can see, is the first letter. It's kind of like an H, so it's an H sound, but it's sort of a big fancy letter that starts off the poem. The first line is in all caps, and then the rest is normal undercase. Okay, so my first question to you guys is, can you find a thorn? Can you find that voiceless fricative? Whoops, that's not what I meant to do. Anywhere in here. So remember that the thorn, it has a long kind of stem on the top and the bottom, and then what looks like a P. It's kind of like a bubble in the middle. So here is one. Here's another. Here's another. There are lots. And remember that this is, and we have some phonology rules that we learned weeks ago in phonology, that those fricatives remain voiceless when they're at the beginning of a word or next to another unvoiced sound. So we can see this one here is at the beginning of the word. It means it's going to be the th sound, not the th sound, right? So it's voiceless, not voiced. And then we've also learned weeks ago in phonology that voiceless fricatives, they become voiced between vowels or between other voiced sounds. So we can see here, this is the counterpart to the thorn. It's the voiced version. So this says hu-the, and that's voiced. Okay, look at this letter here. This letter is what's called a win. It kind of looks like a P, but it's not a P, it's a hua sound. So what do you think that this word is right here? This one. Hui. It's we. So just like in modern English, it's just spelled differently. Anytime you see this letter, it's a W sound. And anytime you see this word, it's we. It's the plural. And this letter is called a win. It's a runic letter. Okay, so here's the thorn. It's also a runic letter. You'll recognize this thorn or the F sound. Oh, I have the rules written out here. We did this in class together. And we know that this is unvoiced. It's devoiced because it's at the beginning of a word. All right, and then here's the F. It's ironically called an F, not an ev, even though it's voiced. And this word here, that is kind of circled, it's actually a compound word. It's two words put together, and Old English did a lot of this. The first word is pronounced who, oo, and the second word is pronounced the. And together it says who-the, and it means how then. How and then are separate words in Old English, but when put together as a compound, it's its own word, and it's often put together compoundly, how then. So we have three runic letters in the midst of all these other Latin letters, the win, the thorn, and the F. Okay, so if we're talking about literature and Old English, there are some really good questions that we should ask about it that we ask about all the other literature that we read in class. So first of all, what's the style of Beowulf? Well, Beowulf uses rhetoric. It uses something called boasting. It uses something called litotes, and fighting. We're going to go through one by one and talk about what each of these are, but these four things compose the style of the writing in Beowulf. And the style of the writing comes from the oral culture. So in rhetoric, you guys probably know what this means. You learned it in English 101. It's the art of persuasion through language. So here, whoever is speaking or writing, they're attempting to get the reader to think, feel, and act in a certain way, right? So they're trying to persuade the reader to use their mind, to use their heart, and to behave in certain ways. There are four ways that writers or speakers try to do that, and we have names for these ways. The speaker, the person who is speaking or writing, the purpose, or what the goal is, the medium, so is it through writing, is it through song, is it through speaking, and the audience, who's being persuaded, or hopefully being persuaded, who's reading or listening. So the Anglo-Saxons valued what a warrior does with his sword and also how he talks about what he does with his sword. So those are equal values. And even though they spent a lot of time out on the battlefield and fighting other tribes, they spent a lot of time together, all together as a tribe in one long house, drinking mead, which is a honey alcohol drink, and basically telling stories. The way that they told the story, or the style, it determined how dominant or how valued that warrior is. So not only are his skills on the battlefield important, but also his skills in the longhouse or in the mead hall. So boasting is another rhetorical style that Beowulf, or Old English, has, and it's very much based on culture. So boasting means bragging, or it means talking about your good skills or your good qualities. They would boast about their skills in the mead hall, and it was very much ritualized. They would all meet together, they'd all have to be there, and they all take turns performing. And they would ritualize boasting about ancestry, so who their ancestors were, their accomplishments, what they've done, their heroic qualities, right, those qualities that they have, and then promises for the future. Who's the next tribal warrior they're going to kill, or what are they going to do for their community. These are the four ways that they would boast, and these were ritualized, which means performative. Okay, so litotes, this is a way of boasting while remaining humble. So what that means is that they would try to find a way to show off while pretending not to show off. And it's done in a very specific way. And we all do this today, so this will seem familiar. You put all of your positive qualities in negative terms. And what this depends on is irony, something that you guys know about from literature, and understatement in order to make your point. So this guy over here says, I am unfamiliar with defeat in warfare. So try to answer the question, how is he boasting or talking about his good qualities while using negation, while talking about it in negative terms? So we can start just by looking at the negation that's there. Here, so we have unfamiliar, and we know from morphology what that means. So not familiar. It seems like a negative thing, but what is he saying he's not familiar with? Well, with defeat, right? So it turns out to be a positive thing, actually, in warfare. He's basically saying he always wins in battle. He doesn't know anything about losing a fight, right? The implication, which is semantics and pragmatics, the implication is that he only knows about winning a fight. So this is something that they did. We still do it now. Here is a text I sent my husband Andrew. Not bad, LeBron. Clap, 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 clap. Okay, so LeBron James is dunking there. It's a pretty amazing dunk. We're all watching him. And I'm using negation. I'm using both bad and then I'm negating the bad, not trying to say that it's a good thing. However, what I really mean is that it's pretty amazing. So sometimes we phrase things in negative terms that are actually positive in order to be ironic or to underplay how great something is. We do this all the time now. Try to think about how you do this in conversation with your friends or with your family. This is very much part of the Anglo-Saxons or the Germanic tribes' skills with language. Okay, flighting, that's the last thing we're going to talk about in style. Flighting is a ritualized and competitive exchange of insults, usually in verse. They would use it as entertainment or domination. It's basically a verbal battle. It's a battle with words as weapons and shields. So what they do is they all get together in the mead hall. They're all telling stories. They're taking turns. It's a ritual, and they're getting drunk. And in verse, they try to show who is the greater warrior by putting the other one down. They're very good at this. You have to be really quick in your mind and really skilled with language in order to do this kind of thing, and especially do it in verse. So a warrior's capacity of using language is almost as important as his capacity on the battlefield, right? You can't have one without the other, and it goes both ways. Beowulf is full of this. Almost all of Beowulf, the story, it's told in these terms, in the terms of flighting, in the terms of litotes, in the terms of boasting, and with rhetoric, trying to persuade. Okay, so the rhythm of Beowulf is also interesting, and it's very difficult to understand it if you can't read fluent Old English, but it's there for sure. Assonance and consonants are both alliteration, and alliteration is the repetition of sound. We've looked at that in phonology. You guys looked at that in your poems. Caesura it's basically their version of rhythm that they did in their poetry long ago, and we have a different kind of rhythm that we use now. Let's just take a look at the rhythm in one of your poems that you analyzed, I think Razi's. Okay, yeah, so here we have a lot of the rhythm is very heavy on the end of the line, and that's where the rhyme comes in. So fair, where, there, claim, and same. And a lot of poetry in modern English is like this. Even in Middle English, it was a little bit like this, but in Old English, it was not like that at all. Let's take a look at what it was like in Old English. Okay, so you may have noticed that there's kind of a break in each line, and every line of Beowulf is broken into two sections. Um, I've put a little squiggly line here so you can see, but what happens here is that they use consonants and assonants in a very particular form. And this is the way that warriors would repeat this poem orally. So you'd have to be really quick on your feet, or rather quick in your mind, in order to do this. So here we see the alliteration of ske, ske. It's always two in the first part and one in the second part. We see it here with the sound, It's two in the first part and one in the second part. And we see it here in the third line with the and a, two in the first part, one in the second part, with a little bit of a division between. And this division, you would hear it orally. So as someone is saying it, oft skeld skelfing, skethena, thretum. So you have a little pause here. I'm terrible at reciting Old English, but you can imagine what it might sound like. So this rhythm is very different from what we know now in poetry. And as we get near to the end of the term, you guys can do some more comparative between Old English and Modern English. Okay, lastly, one of the most exciting things that is in Beowulf and in Old English in general is this thing called kennings. This here, kennings, K-E-N-N-I-N-G-S. Kennings are metaphors, and I call them literal metaphors, which is kind of an oxymoron, and it makes me laugh a bit, but they're literal metaphors. So rather than saying the word for something with just one noun, like book, I may say something like soft pages. Here, let's see if you guys can guess what each of these is. So life liquid, what do you think that is? So one of your classmates guessed water, right? Because we think of it as like the liquid of life. But this is more of like the actual lives that people inhabit, not what we consume. So when you cut open a body, what falls out? It's not water, even though we're 70% water. It's blood, right? So life liquid is blood. We can type this in here. Okay, here I have the Old English. We see the f. This fricative is between two vowel sounds, so we know it's actually voiced. V, hovenus, gem, heaven's gem. The S is the plural, or the possessive, rather. What do you think heaven's gem is? Some people translate it as heaven's jewel, but it's the sun. So they're literally thinking, where is heaven? Oh, it's up above, it's in the sky, and it's a gem, right? It's beautiful, it glows, it attracts light. Okay, wound sea. Here I have the Old English. What do you think wound sea is? So it's blood or bleeding, right? Because it's flowing from a wound. So it's quite literally a metaphor, if you know what I mean. Okay, bone house. What do you think the noun bone house is referring to? And remember, it's not going to be something like cemetery or casket, because it's thinking more literally. What houses your bones? Your body. Okay, raven harvest. This is a little bit more difficult because it's very geographically cultural. In the US, we have crows. In the UK and Scandinavia, they have ravens. Ravens are gigantic black birds, and they feast on dead carcasses, so dead bodies. A raven harvest would be a carcass or a corpse. So if I were dead and you were referring to my body, rather than saying that's Jamalie's corpse, you'd say that's Jamalie's raven harvest. And please, when you find my dead body, call it that. That would make me really happy. Okay, I filled this one in. Mine's worth. Um, worth, mind. Again, we have possession here. Possession, the affix changes according to if it's accusative or dative or nominative. It's just part of the case that Old English uses. But it means honor, right? So honor isn't necessarily in the body, it's not necessarily on the battlefield, but it's your mind. It's the worth of your mind is honor. And I think that's pretty interesting. It has some interesting implications and tells you a little bit about their culture. Ooh, exciting. Okay, Whale Road. I like this one. And we've seen this Old English word before in our, I think it was in our syntax slides, but it looks like whale, right? Whale and road. Whale Road. What do you think that is? It's actually the sea. It wouldn't be a river because whales aren't freshwater mammals, but well, some dolphins go into freshwater, I guess. But this is the sea. The Anglo-Saxons were very sea and water oriented. They took their boats everywhere. In fact, for a longest time, they didn't even use the Roman roads that were built in Britain. Their settlements were on the sea and on rivers, and they would just get in their boat and go upriver or downriver in order to get somewhere. Okay. The wave swine is a ship. So what do you think heaven candle is? Heaven candle in Old English. So it's quite literally a candle is light, right? And in heaven, it means it's above in the sky. So this too is sun. So it's not like they just had one for the sun, like heaven's gem. They had multiple metaphors or kennings for a noun. And then finally, breather of the sea. And this would not have been a preposition that was by itself in Old English. Remember, prepositions were affixes, but it means wind. So think about what your language has in terms of kennings, right? What compound words are metaphors for the actual noun? We have lots in English, and I think a lot of languages have them. But it's something like 70% of Beowulf is made up of kennings, and that's quite a bit of language. So as you're reading through Beowulf, just take note of what you think these kennings are. Another interesting thing about kennings is that this word is still used today in modern English. It's not used by Americans, and it's not really used by Brits, but it is used by the Welsh and the Scots. And the Welsh and the Scots are people who were, they were native people in Britain. They were colonized by the Anglo-Saxons, and they adopted each other's language. Ken is the verb form of kennings. So kennings is a noun. Ken is a verb. And they still speak it today. So if you've ever heard Dr. Christopher say, I ken it well, it means I know it well. So kenning is literally knowledge, and to ken something is to know something. There are lots of words from Old English that especially the Scottish still use today, and some Americans do as well. We'll go over that later. I think it's pretty exciting. Okay, well, I think that's the end of this video. That didn't take too long. In class today on Zoom, we did talk about exercise 6. So exercise 6 is based on the chapter and the slides about the Anglo-Saxons. I have composed the questions and scored the questions based on the cognitive processing that I'm testing. There are 6 levels. You can read about it right here. And I ask you to make an argument. That's the highest level. And I ask you questions about the days of the week. That's from the slides from 2 weeks ago. I ask you to compare it to your native language. you were supposed to choose a branch of Indo-European to focus on. Oops, no, don't do that. And you have to tell me about that branch that you focused on. I have some multiple choice questions here. These are based on some very early changes. So as you know, a lot of Indo-European languages, a lot of them stayed the same and Germanic changed. And English is more close to Germanic than, the other Indo-European languages like Farsi or Latin, Spanish, Italian. So I ask you to analyze some of those changes. I ask you about cognates here. Okay. I ask you to analyze the difference or similarity between the early Indo-European languages and how they show up now in Latin, Greek, Welsh, English, Icelandic, and Dutch. So you can give me an answer to that based on what you know about phonology. And then I ask you about Grimm's law and Werner's law. You basically have to make some guesses as to what kind of cultural phenomena would cause change for one branch of a language to change and not another, right? So what made the Germanic languages be different than the non-Germanic ones? Okay, and then I also ask you to pay attention to the calendar. So exercise 6 is due tonight. Exercise 5 is due on Sunday. We'll have a class on Sunday and you can ask questions about that. Exercise 7 will be based on the other chapters and Canterbury Tales. And then your paper is due on the 11th. It's coming up pretty soon. After the weekend, you'll have to write a proposal for me. So you need to start having ideas about your paper. And if you haven't yet, take a look at what your paper is about. So under assignments and exercises, first a paper assignment, read through that. And then I also have a video where I talk about it. The other thing that you want to take a look at is, I think it's called Week 6 Theoretical Questions. Yeah, this one here. So I have a video talking about how to develop theoretical questions and what does it even mean to have a theoretical question. Okay, thanks guys. Sorry I wasn't able to record the classroom session, but hopefully this video makes up for it. I love you all. See you all on Sunday at 2:15.